Welcome. This is going to be a multi-part series explaining different parts that were required to make this scene that is in front of you. This is just the render view of the blend you see from Blender. To start this project, I started with FSpy. This is a software which allows you to input an image in, which allows you to line up the axes of the Y and X and Z axis. As you can see, there's the Z axis here, and the Y axis there. Then you can place a point down which shows you what the field of view and angle will be like for everything, any point in the scene. As you can see as I move this, the angle changes. One thing I should add is these are the axes that you can move. You move them to places that you know are straight and that change in the scene. So as I've shown, these two main lines for the Y-axis is here, and another main line here, because I know that's straight and those point towards the focal point. If I can move this Z-axis to up there, dim it so you can see it better, move it to there, I know that's straight. Straight vertical. Or I can move this one over here into there. So you can line them up to the lines you know that are perfectly straight in the scene, and that's what maps out the focal point, focal length and angle and position the camera will be in. And with an add-on to Blender, I can add this straight in to Blender, which creates the camera, which you see here. Go into solid view. This camera is placed, if I go to import, I'll import it again. Import. Yes. Oh, I don't have it added on yet, so I need to go to Preferences, Add-ons, and go to FSpy. Click that, and go back to Import. That's f.fspy. And then you can go to the file, Laundrette FSpy. This creates a camera that has a background image set up so that you can change the background image. It just sits on top. It allows you to place objects in the image, but it doesn't actually exist. So that's where this camera is. It places it down exactly where the angle will be correct, position will be correct above the floor, and the field of view of the camera will be correct. So it's set to almost 70. So that if you're in this camera, turn the background image off, you move a thing, move something, it'll change the field of view. It'll be stretched technically back if you go behind the camera. It changes exactly how the field of view was like in this original picture. It was incredibly helpful to getting the basis for it to set up. And then I often turned on and off the background image to line everything up. As you can see, it lines up pretty well in this scene. And then now I can place objects in the scene. So I started with this object. I actually started with a cube, which I then scaled up to the right size, went into edit mode, and deleted one of the sides. So you've got an open side. Let's move this out of the way. Got one open side. Then you can adjust all the corners. So I added a cut across here, took this wall out, extruded it backwards, deleted this face, and that's basically how I made the room. And then also there was raised edge here. So that's basically how I made the room, editing it, moving it around so it fit the scene, move the corners up and down, back and forth, so it fits exactly with this camera, so it fit this view, raised this edge as it raised in the image. However, in doing this, I came up with a bit of a problem. Because I extruded this up and extruded this to the side, it messed up with the geometry of it. So not everything's square. This floor is made up, this side has multiple edges to it. And then this edge too, nothing's perfectly square, and then this line is, if I select this line, it goes all the way down there, so there's two overlapping lines, which caused some problems later down the line and could have been improved, so I would have used a separate object in this position. I put a cube there and then mapped it along the right path and done it like that in separate objects, as it makes everything fit together easier. It would have helped me down the line. There were definitely some improvements I could have made throughout the whole process. And then the first thing I did, because it's a scene with one light source, and that's one of the very important things in this scene, as you can see in the background image, there's just this one bar light at the back of the room. I then created this bar light, which is just a cylinder, basically, that I stretched and smoothed-ish cylinder, rotated it by 90 degrees, and stretched it out in the x-axis, scaled it down where I needed it to, and just fit it to what I could see from the camera. And then to make it actually emit light, I gave it an emission blender, an emission material. As you can see here, it's got just a slightly blue color, as the image was very blue, and just an emission blender. It's a very simple thing to do in Blender. There are lots of others that for basic diffusion, and then basic one is Principled BSDF, which gives you lots of settings for everything about it. But as it was just giving off light, I just set it to an emission material and set the brightness. This was all changed later on, and I'll explain this better in one of the other videos, which I talk about the materials. The next thing, I also made some brackets for this light, so it wasn't just floating on the side of the building. This is simply a cube, which I shaped just to the right size, and then bevel the edges. So I can go into this edit mode, select these two edges, size this down, click bevel, add some more sides, so it's not just one flat side, round it off, and just did that. So you can simply does that quite simply. I then later on also added some bevels around the edges just to soften everything up a bit, soften the edges a bit. I also later on, after I realised there's this dark patch behind the light, so I added this back bit as a supporting thing, which you usually see in light, but this wasn't here at first, so it's just sat there. And in the image, you can see that. If I turn this up, there is a slight dark patch behind it around the thing, which is because of a backing of support. So I just added that later on, and also to make this backing is basically just a long cube. Because I actually rounded off the inside edges, as you can see. To make this, I took a version of this cylinder, so scaled it up a bit, and then you can add a Boolean modifier, which takes an object and cuts it out of another. So I took this and then selected the cylinder that was there and cut another cylinder out of it, and then hid the other cylinder so that it would stay rounded, but you couldn't see the object that cut out. The Boolean modifier is something that I used a lot in this, and it was necessary to make a lot of the things I did. The first proper object I did were these dryers, which is simply cubes. This cursor I'm placing around this cursor here is something I drag around. It's where all the objects I bring in are placed. So there's a cube that starts and is centered around that. It's basically a cube, scaled down to fit what the image I saw in the image. Just roughly scale it, and then go into edit mode. You can add a cut around just the top here. Add another cut a bit below, another cut. Oh, not there. Another cut up here, slightly. And then you can select this outer edge, scaled it in, just like that. It creates this bevel, as you can see here. I later on just added a bevel to pretty much all the edges to soften everything up a bit. And I filled around this to make it just seem right, fit the image. In the image, these aren't flat, these are bent slightly, they're indented, as you can see here, slightly dented in, especially in the image. So to do that, I subdivided all of these faces into hundreds of different tiny squares. It allows me to go into Sculpt Mode. So I'll explain it on this thing. I subdivide all the faces, cuts them into squares, change it up to 10 now. So that's cut faces, then I can go to Sculpt up top. It gives me a bunch of sculpting tools, as you can see down the left here. I just stuck with the basic one, just kind of pulls in and out. So he pulls out, set to minus, pulls in. I just fiddled with the strength, pull the strength out of it, and just kind of roughly pushed it in a bit, just so it's not as regular, just a bit more natural almost. And as you can see, it's kind of square. That helps with adding more subdivisions, adds more squares, but also you can, so if we go back to modeling, one thing you can also do is add a shade smooth. As you can see, it kind of shades the corners as well, but with an edge split to stop the corners. Stop saying it kind of blends in this dent, and it's a smooth curve indent, which I made one of these basically. I made one of these dryers. I then used an array modifier. Which you see just makes the second one pretty much. If I change that, it pulls it that way. Or I can set that to 0, change the Y to 1, makes it that way, and puts 1 next to it. I did this for the 8 times it makes it. So I can put this over here. 8 times it does that. And that's how I got all these quite quickly. It's kind of just shortcuts you got to take to speed everything up. This took hours and hours to make. I didn't sculpt this at first. I array modified it and then sculpted it after, so they're all slightly different. If I apply this modifier, I apply this in array modifier, so it actually leave modeling, and then apply this modifier, apply. Now these are all separate objects, but I can sculpt them all. So I can sculpt them all separately, and they all look a bit different. It just makes it look a bit better, a bit less regular. So if we delete these now, I don't need these anymore. Delete these. That was basically how I did the dryers, and then just little bits of finishing touching all over the place, kind of adding what seemed right, fit the image a bit. Then the next thing was one of my favourite things in this was the washing machines, which are probably one of the most detailed things in the scene, and it just required a lot of piecing together everything. As you can see over here, this is where I started it. This is where I create most of my objects over on the side here and put them straight into the scene. So I can change the scale I don't have to worry about fitting it in the screen as kind of you could see, everything got in the way of it. Things sometimes go through the wall and stuff like that. So I started over here. This is just, I made of lots of different pieces. So you can see there's pieces here. This is what seemed right. So made it slightly stretched in and out on that way kind of thing to make it what seemed like a washing machine should be. And then to create this metal rim, I took this outer circle, I started with a cylinder, 90 degrees around the x-axis, so it sticks out. Scaled it down a bit. And then I took another cylinder, so if I duplicate that, and scale that down inside of it, pull it out of it, and use the Boolean modifier I talked about before. So I link these two together with this eye color picker. Oh, I did it the wrong way around. So yeah, there you go. So I link those, and then it cuts out the whole of the other cylinder inside this shape. It creates this metal rim, which I'm talking about. It's just a simple way to create this rim. And then I added this handle, which was another whole cylinder, which you can kind of see fits in, so 90 degrees. So a cylinder there that I then did a Boolean of this other cylinder. So bring another cylinder 90 degrees around the x-axis, and then did a Boolean modifier, but instead I did a union, which not union, was intersect. So it brings this cutout in that's just the size of just that kind of rounded shape. And that's all I needed. I just hit that handle, just kind of making simplest ways to make that shape. Then I also created, just using cubes and Boolean modifiers, created this edge here, just door hinge kind of thing. And raised bed edge here, which is just, I believe it's an extruded plane. Rotate it by 90 degrees. Then in this face, I can take this face, extrude, and bring it out, bring some depth. And I also used another Boolean modifier of one of the same cylinders. And cut out this curve indent here, so you can see it's got this curve in it. And just moved everything so it fit and what I think a washing machine should look like. And roughly basing off the image once in the image. Because I knew it had this raised black edge in the image. If I go back to this image, set the camera, add the background image again, it had this kind of raised bottom and slight curve in it. I just did it what I thought seemed right. And then the next step I think was this handle, which I basically started with Bezier Curve. So if I add a cursor there, and then add curve, Bezier, I can then, it creates this curve which you can shape and move around. I think I started with a circle, which I can rotate by the rotate tool, take that by 90 degrees, scale it down a bit, then adjust these corners, so bring that down, and make the whole thing a bit smaller. Make the whole thing a bit smaller, just make what seemed right. Y-axis, X-axis, bring it out a bit. Just going to move things around so it seemed like roughly this shape. And then with the Bezier curve, because it's actually a curve, it's not a model, doesn't have any depth to it. It's infinitely thin, so it doesn't actually do anything. I can then add a depth to it. Or so if I add an extrude, it makes it kind of, it adds a kind of length. It makes it longer. But I didn't use it, I used bevel here, which depth makes the bevel, it turns into a round tube, which is kind of a smooth tube that kind of, it's pretty much a mesh at this point, because this Bezier curve is not a mesh. It still isn't a mesh. However, I can turn it into a mesh, like this, and then now it's made of these faces. Blender changed it to. I then took this, used a boolean to boolean it out of this face, just like I did up here, to make this indented handle kind of outline, just around here, make it a draw outline. And I did a pretty similar thing with this handle right here. I took a cylinder, scaled it down obviously, rotated it by around the y-axis, about 90 degrees I think. 90 degrees, there you go. Stretched it into what seemed right. Then I stretched it in the z-axis, make it longer. Rotated it to an angle kind of to indent in. And pushed it into the object to cut out. If I did it again, I'll show you. It adds a boolean of this object, the difference again. And that cuts it out into this, so you've got this object. If I pull it out again, you can see more of that curve. It's also running into the back of this cube, as this is just a layer on top. So there's a flat side here as well. Go to hide this. See, it kind of curves in. It's just creating this handle. So yeah, I just did what seemed right. Just delete that, don't need that anymore. No, that was about that. And then the next steps with this washing machine, I created these vents, which was something I used a lot through this thing. There's these vents here, which I put up here. There's the vents there. And to make these, because I'd used the array modifier earlier, I thought I could, to make the vent, it's just a repeated angled thing. And I was experimenting with it. I can duplicate it up and down. So I made one, so let's do it down here. I made one plane, I think, and then scale it down a bit, scale it on the x-axis, scale it on the y, just to make it smaller. Move the face. Now rotate it. Rotate it to an angle that seemed about right. I think I chose 60 degrees. Then I use an array modifier to duplicate it. However, as you can see here, that's not right. Add it to the Z1. However, it chooses, yeah, there you go, -1 on the Y, -1.1. So it shifts it kind of one up its own width down the Y. However, because I rotated it, its own Y is on this axis. It's not on the axis. The global Y is, this is the global Y axis. So it gets shifted down this way. And at first, the only way I knew how to fix it was fiddling with the Z axis as well to make it sit at the right height above this, which was a pain to get right, and it took me a while. But that's what I did. This is why this is, with this one, it's got -2 and -0.14, because if I change that, it changes there. However, later on I found out you can reset the rotation. So if I get rid of this array modifier, you do Control A and reset the rotation. And if I add this array modifier back, it now does it. If I do it to the Z-axis, set it to 1, shifts it by 1 in the global Z-axis. So it's actually one I needed. Would have sped me off a bit of time, but now I know it. I can use it later on. It's just something I found I should kind of remember. It's quite important. I use it in different places as well, this resetting of scale and rotation. And then I also, for this vents, I also just needed an Inset Cube, which is basically, in short, it's just a cube with, when it's edit mode, then you can do, there's an inset tool here. You can put that vision, insets the face slightly, and then extruded it. That's all I did. Makes an outline. It's just a simple way of making an indented, like outer edge. So I just use this multiple times. Used it here. There you go. And just set the arrays and the arrayed vent things inside of it, and just did that. It's quite easy. And then that's basically the washing machine done. Later on, I did. So you can see here, I did fiddle with it in pieces. It's got beveled edges here. Everything's got a bit of beveled edges. I also added an extruded edge just around here. So there's this bump around the edge, which adds a bit of depth, more depth. Just kind of works a bit better. So I just played around with it. And this is also an array modifier, so I can change the number of washing machines here. So it's just the easiest way to line them up perfectly. And then you only do an array modifier in one axis though, so I did have to only have one. I've had two for the top and bottom. And there's another washing machine over here, which is just the same one. I squashed it a bit to fit the image better. If you go to the image, there's a washing machine over here. And I basically, to also add a bit more depth, because you should only see this side really, I did the Inset Face Cube again, just to add kind of a panel that you could move in a sense. In the material view, it kind of, you can just adds a bit more, stops it being so regular. And one thing with the washing machine, I also have this control panel up here. I thought it just kind of adds a bit more variance in it. This is basically just a lot of the same Inset Cube. As you can see if I go into wireframe, same Inset Cube. There's wireframe, solid, and material preview. Rendered is what you saw at the beginning. Kind of shows everything with all the light paths, ray trace paths with the light rays. Solid is just this normal view, good for modeling. That doesn't have any color or texture. It's just basic. It doesn't take in anything from the lighting. Very fast. And there's wireframe. It cuts out the sides. You can just see the edges of everything. Useful for if you need to select a lot through something, or there's this backing, there's stuff inside of this cube which in the back I can get to if you're looking in solid view. Then there's also material preview, which is a bit slow sometimes. There's so many materials here. It gives you the material of everything you set to in a kind of preview state. It's not taking in any of the light to reflect it or bump displacements and making it rougher. It's just kind of showing you roughly what it looks like. So it's giving you what the floor looks like, but with a fake background. As you can see, kind of green. And in here green, it's kind of taking an outer image, which is a tree scene, which is the default one in Blender. And it kind of uses that as the light source, even though there is no, it's kind of so that you can see everything without having to trace the rays of light as you do in rendered mode. So yeah, this control panel is just a bunch of cylinders, cubes, a cylinder. This is a cone that I then reduce the faces down to 3. So if I put a cone in, that's the cone. And then down here I can turn the number of vertices down. Set it to 3, it just basically becomes a pyramid or tetrahedron. Or you could add more and turn it into a cone. But I thought it worked quite well with just 3, so I did that. Just adding objects, messing around with things to see what looked best. Next object I did was I created this fire extinguisher, because in the back of the room, if you go to the image, there's this fire extinguisher in the back. So I thought that was quite important to have. So I made this fire extinguisher. I started with a box. This is just a cube with 2 beveled edges, as simple as it gets. I also thought later on I needed a glass face. So in material preview, this is glass. So I just basically had this cube and then inset the face into it, and then lifted up one of the edges to fit roughly a glass panel. With this fire extinguisher, it's a bit more complicated. I started with a cylinder, beveled the top so it rounded, and then extruded the face up, and beveled it, moved it in, moved the edges around it, cut round faces, extruded out to get this tube. So it's basically just this main tube which has one object, and the other 3 objects are different. These are 3 different objects. This is a different object to those 3. And then, so yeah, I just made a basic shape of a fire extinguisher using reference images. And with these reference images, I did use references from online. And to look at them, I found this software called PureRef, which is quite useful. It shows you kind of use this overlay thing, so I can set it to always stay on top and still focus on the stream, but it's just sitting in the background. And I can just drop images into it. And it's just a canvas that you can infinitely get big and move around the images. It's quite useful. But I had these fire extinguishers here, it's just giving me a rough shaping. And then that was one of the rendered scenes, and that's the image. So it's just a very useful sort of tool I used. So with this, this is another cylinder with an extruded face. So if I I'll get out of edit mode. I bring in a cylinder here. Bring the radius down to 0.1, depth down to 0.2. Then you can rotate it around the y-axis, 90 degrees, scale it down, whatever. Then you can add a loop cut around here, and then select these faces. So if I go into face select these faces, and you can extrude. There are multiple different extrude things. Extrude face would just extrude it in one direction. It doesn't really help in this case. Extrude individual faces pulls them out, but kind of as the faces themselves, not connected or anything. Manifold does the same thing, similar to the first one, but it removes the faces that were there already. It kind of just shifts everything. But faces along normal, it stretches along the normal of each face. If you don't know what the normal is of a face, it's basically just the opposite of the tangent, perpendicular to the face. The tangent has one meeting point that goes off in each direction. Normal comes straight out 90 degrees to it. It's outwards, but keeps everything connected. So it creates this outer edge, which works. That's how I created this. And then with this is pretty similar. This is another cylinder, but instead I extruded inwards to create this inset face. So here, inset this face. I also insert a face here because I might have changed the texture here, but I don't think I ever used that because it's such a small thing in the background. It's hard to see anyway. Then with this handle, I started with a cube and just kept pulling at the corners, extruded the faces out, and then I also used. If I make a cube here, I can show you. Make a cube, and then I made loads of cuts down the side, so you can increase the number of cuts with this loop cut tool. Put them where I wanted them, and then one tool I used was proportional editing thing up here. It's basically allows you to. That's how it would normally look without it, pretty much as well. But there you go. It just moves up one face. But if I turn that on, and I can add proportional editing to this movement. Then down here I can change how proportional it is and what shape it is. So it's smooth. I can either have an inverse square, which is kind of rounded, or I can have sharp, so it's pointy, as you can see. It kind of allows you to move things, the lines next to it, not as much as the main one you're trying to move. So I choose smooth and rounded it off just to kind of. That's how I got this kind of rounded top edge. And I pulled one of these corners up. Pulled one of those up, and just with proportional editing, pulled this down. And similar here, I did the same thing, extruded the face out diagonally, and then rounded it off with proportional editing, just what seemed right. Extruded some faces to add some width wider there, and whatnot. Just kept adding to it. I then moved this inside of here. So if I go into wireframe, you can see there's one inside here, because this is going to be glass in the actual material preview. So you can see into the box with the thing in the box. So yeah, this is all one object, but so this is then what I copied into the scene. It's in the back of the scene. And as you can see here, there's actually something else here, which is another glass pane, which was basically just a plane that I extruded the edges and rounded the edges of, so that it kind of adds another layer of glass, so the whole thing was shiny, and had the same material. Because in the image, as you can see in PureF, or if I go to the camera view, there's kind of the whole thing's shiny with the same shininess, not just the glass in the center, as the red wasn't shiny enough. So yeah, I just kept adding to it. One of the other things I did was this back here, which is another, in the image you can see, if I go to the camera view, there's a kind of another fire alarm here, just an alarm button instead of an extinguisher, which if I hide this, you can see I cut out a hole in the wall to start with, and then added a cube in to fit the wall, inset a face and extruded it inwards so that you could see, just kind of adds a bit more depth. It creates that outline that you can there's kind of an outer edge in this, you can see in this. And then I inset another face into it here and extruded that inwards. Then I inset another face and extruded it outwards to create this square shape, which I then pulled in these corners. So I can, if I make it, choose these corners in vertices. So there are 3 views I can go to. I've got vertice view, which is this. I can choose the vertices of all these points. Or I can choose line view, which allows me to choose these lines, the whole edges, all of the edges. And there's face view, which allows me to choose that face, all the faces in between the lines. So I started with these edges and then kind of without proportional editing on. As you can see, that's what proportional does. And then I can pull them out on the y-axis, just kind of in and out to make it a bit more diagonal kind of thing. Just what looked right to me. This is now glass. Then if we go inside of here, you can see in wireframe mode, I also added this handle, which is just a cylinder and a rectangle, as simple as it gets. One of the others is these boxes on the side here. This is just one box I created over here. You can see I basically started with a cube, which I beveled an edge of. So let's make it, I can show you how I did it. Took a cube, went to the edge view, beveled this edge. I just choose one face, so it creates this flat thing. I then took these faces and then deleted them. It creates this inside, and then but this wall is infinitely flat. It has an X and Y kind of thing, or a Z and Y. However, it has no X depth, so I took a modifier and solidified it, which you can kind of change the thickness of, as you can see, but it just kind of adds that thickness to it, as you can see over here. And then to add the lid, I basically went into edit mode, took this face, applied this, took this face, extruded it out, up pretty much, and then backwards a bit. I can just move it backwards. And then with this face, I inset it. I inset this face, inset, extruded it inwards. I think. There you go. And then I rounded the corners. So I took this edge, took these inside edges as well, took those edges and beveled them. And that's basically it. That's basically how I made this box. And then I used an array modifier again just to duplicate them in, so I can add more or add less. I found what an offset seemed right, just kind of roughly center them on the briars. That's what you could kind of see from the image. It's not exactly the same, but it fits and it looks right from the camera. So from here, turn the background image off. It matches just what seemed right. The next task I did, which was kind of an interesting one, it was a bit different to usual, was this laundry basket, which is quite dramatic. And from these normal tasks that you do with just boxes and cubes and stuff, I didn't first see how I could possibly go about this, which was something I needed to I had to change how I thought about it, because I didn't actually use cylinders for this. These aren't cylinders that I then bent the corners of. I started with Bezier Curve, but basically, if I go over to the side here, then I added a Bezier Curve. Took Bezier Curve. I think I deleted these vertices and extruded on my own, added my own faces. Pretty much that roughly shaped, took the rough shape of what I needed. Then pull these to what seemed right into this tube, into these tube shapes, which is kind of a bottom, flat bottomy, and then rounded corners slightly. I don't need that one there. roughly what seemed right. And then I did what I did before, and added a bevel here. And it just adds this depth. This is obviously nothing like perfect like I did here. This is just 3 points, I believe. And that's all I did, and just took the right depth. And then I turned this into an array that modified this multiple times, so not on the X, on the Y. And then duplicated it a few times and had that. I also, once I had that, I also pulled out. So if I apply this, I turn this to a mesh first. I have to turn it into a mesh. Now these are all separate, but I also then took this center one, and then I did proportional editing, scaled it out on the x-axis. Turn the proportional down, but it kind of adds that bit of curve which these baskets have slightly, so you can see it's kind of very, very slightly curve. Took this, duplicated it, and then rotated it by 90 degrees. Rotated it by 90 degrees. There you go. So it's like that. And then centered it on top, pretty much. And I mean, this obviously looks awful. That's basically how I created this. A bit more fiddling, obviously. It took some learning to get used to, but it was quite fun and different to all these other shapes. And then also did the same for the top, which I took a circle. So I took a circle, edged it, pulled out these. I took all the edges, but then scaled it out. Oh, that's not how I did it. Yeah, let's get rid of these ones. Scaled it out roughly to kind of square off the edges. Don't know why it rotates. But kind of pull it out, and then obviously add another bevel. Kind of, yeah, it kind of creates that more squared circle. I arrayed it down this time, like I did before. So in the Z, -1. Kind of just added it. I only need 3 this time. Yeah, just did that, and then yeah. So I had that. I obviously turned it into a mesh again. Then I took, but this time I took the bottom. I just took the bottom one. So in wireframe, so you can select all the faces. Took this and scaled it in a bit, so it kind of makes that kind of slightly smaller bottom than top. Just fiddling around to make it look good. What it should look like. So I use this reference images in the back, so you can drop. And the same with this, you can drop images into Blender, and they come in as empties, which are just, they have no depth or much information. It's just an image. So I could just kind of base everything off that. With these legs, this was a cylinder. I did start with a cylinder, so it would be more straight, because these beveled edges, these Bezier curves, aren't perfectly straight. As you can see, it's kind of got this kind of kink in it. It isn't perfect. Right, so for this, I took a cylinder, which rotated by 90 degrees around the X. There you go. Stretched out in the Y. And then for this one, this was a bit strange because I needed to rotate it by 90 degrees. And to do this, I took, you can take this face, and then you can do Shift S, cursor to selected. Cursor gets put in the center of your selected face. Then over here, I can put view, there's these settings over here, 3D cursor, this is what this red circle is. I can lower it, put it down a bit lower, so put it about there. And then I use spin tool over here, which is pretty simple. You can just spin, and then put 90 degrees in. You can see down here, put 90 degrees. There you go, you have a 90 degree bend. And took this face, extruded it down, there you go. And that's how I made this. I didn't know how to do this at first, and this was something that I realized could be really useful for the future. So I just did this for this one side, and then on this other side as well. I think I actually, extruded both sides. Then to join them up using this beam, I actually took a loop cut here, a loop cut there. Took these two faces because there's a line down the center. It's centered at a line, not one face. So took these faces and just extruded them out this way. That's how I created this beam across the side. A bit thinner as there are less faces on this. There are more faces on this one than this one. Then with the wheels, are also a cylinder, I believe. Just a very short, squished cylinder. I then beveled the edges off. So I rotated it around. And squished it in the X. Went to the edge select that edge, which I can select all edges by holding Alt. It's quite useful. And bevel. So I need to reset the seat. Because I've scaled it strangely, it does much less of a bevel on this than on this face. As you can see, it's loads here, but barely any on this side. So this is where I again need to use Control A to reset scale and bevel it. And then you can see it's got rounded more evenly. I took it to what's seen right. You can see here. I also had an indent, which is pretty simple. Take this face, inset it like I did before, inset again. There you go. You need to go to the center of the object. I need to zoom in. Inset again. Took this. Go to edge select. Took this. I did it on the other side as well, but then pretty much with both of them I scaled them towards each other, but with this I can just, without proportional editing on, pull it inwards and it creates that indent, as you can see in here. And there's a bolt here, which is just a cylinder with a bevel edge of one side. And this flat edge is a plane, which I don't need that anymore. This is a plane. It may seem strange, but if I had a plane, oops. I took a plane, scaled it down a bit, move it out to the side, scaled it down, scaled it in the X, scaled in the Y a bit, then go into edit mode, and you can actually extrude edges of a plane and pull that down, right in the Z, put it down to the side, and move it over that way a bit. First, I actually solidified it. So it adds depth. As you can see, it's kind of got slight depth to it. Even thickness. Then I need to apply that, and then I can take this edge, take this edge, take this edge, this edge. I need that edge as well, and that edge, that edge, that edge. Beveled it, and there you can see it creates something similar to this shape. That's basically how I created this. Also, this lipped edge here is just a loop cut with a, as you can see, so a loop cut there. Then then select all these faces and extrude them along the normals, which just extrudes them outwards. Pretty simple. That's how and then I did it for one side only, and only one wheel I created. Just copied them along the place. When I also had this stuff for when I was going to put it into the scene, I kept all these wheels separate, so I could rotate them so there's a bit more. Both laundry baskets weren't exactly the same. I could rotate all of them individually, which worked quite well. So the wheels were all rotated slightly differently between all of them. It just looks a bit better, looks less natural. The next task I faced was actually inside the scene. I did straight into the scene. The wiring down the back of here. So you can see there's this just bits around here. This wiring, this is a Bezier curve like I did in the thing. As you can see, it's Bezier curve. I can take away the depth. There's no depth. Or I can extrude and whatnot. It's just the same as I did before. I drew it out and pulled the handles, like you can do, just to roughly fit what was in the image. There's Bezier curve. Go to edit mode, you can pull these handles out, and it changes the shape of the curve. And you can pull it out so it's visible. Changes the shape of the curve, so put it that way, changes the shape of the curve, and then make it wide. Just did it to what seemed right, what looked best. Then I also added this bracketing, which is I think just a cylinder. It was a cylinder I added of the same size as the. So yeah. This is why it gets irritating being inside the scene. Back in. Added a cylinder. Move it out so it's visible. Then took the back of it. Took these few faces, extruded them out. No, not along normals. Extruded face outwards. I took these two faces, extruded along normals. And that's basically how I created this. Some beveled edges and just adjusting. It's simply how it works, how I did it. Then I realized in the image it goes into a box. It goes from a wire into a box, you can see. So I created a box, simply just a cube that I then got rid of the bottom faces. It's hollow and you can see straight into it. I did a solidify model first, so it had some edges. It wasn't just infinitely thin. And beveled the corners, so it's just it's a bit softer and doesn't. Sharp edges in modelling can catch the light very easily and just can ruin some of the realism. But I also required some bracketing for it, which this was simply a tiny cube, extruded a loop cut, extruded the cube, extruded the face upwards, beveled the edges. With this, I used Boolean modifiers. For this, I used a cylinder. Scale it down, and then I can rotate it how I need it. 90 degrees. With this, I went into edit mode and used the knife tool. You can see there's a corner there that can lead straight down to this corner here. Corner there, and then linked it back up. Click enter. There you go, now you've got kind of a cube, as these corners are all opposite each other. I just did this. I found this the easiest way to create a kind of a ellipse head screwdriver bit in a way. That's pretty much what I did. Extruded this out like that, and then used a Boolean modifier to inset it into this face. So it creates that effect. Then now I had that one piece, I can duplicate it multiple times. Similar with this is the same tube, I just duplicated it and bent it, added a loop cut and bent it down, added more bracketing. It's simple as it gets. The next step was this hanging light, which as you can see, in the scene, is this hanging beam light. I just started with a cube. With this, there you go. Cube, and then extruded along the X, made it a bit smaller. Just got it to the right shape, I won't bother with it right now. Took the edges, then beveled them a lot. So it kind of creates that very round shape. And that's about it, really. With the edges, I added a loop cut on either side. About there. I think I used numbers up here. If you go into item, you can see there's in the top right with transform, there's number for where it is. I did it properly to evenly space on either side. And then took these bottom faces. Okay, took them and extruded them inwards to add a bit more depth, so it's not as smooth. Also, later on I played with material, so you could tell the difference even more. And with that, I believe I took one of these faces. I took that face and that face, extruded individual faces. Actually extruded them outwards and then lowered them down. That's pretty much how I created these kind of shields, reflective shields that they have on the lights. Then a few very thin cylinders. As in the image you can see, I believe it's chains. It's kind of slightly, it looks like chains. However, I can't easily create chains. They're probably something I would create in the future. It'd be very useful to have as something I can put into all my scenes. There's a lot of these pieces I can reuse. I can take this from this scene and put it in another. One of the things with 3D modeling, it's a lot of stuff you can reuse and put through the place. You don't have to create one thing and it's only for that scene. There's not a high chance I'll use them again, but it's useful to know that I have these as an option. So I think I will make a chain at some point, as it can be very multi-purpose. So I just stuck with the cylinder. It's just a cylinder with more faces than needed, to be honest. That's why it looks so dense with lines. But it's just thin cylinders with reduced radius, and I made one, angled it to the right, one cylinder, rotated it. Yep, what seemed right. And then I actually took it, duplicated it, and scaled it. As you can see, I've got a scale, but then I did on the y-axis to the -1, reset the scale, and rotation, duplicate it, and then scale along the y-axis. As you can see, it's now locked on the y-axis to the -1, and that flips it to the perfect angle, same angle, but on the other side. That's what I did for all of them, duplicated them down. It's quite simple, but a lot of stuff just a lot of stuff that kind of works. Not too hard, but there's just a lot that goes into it, a lot of tiny details. And that's kind of why I'm making these videos, to show off these tiny details that you don't see, you don't usually notice during the scene. So yeah, and then there's stuff in the back here. These are just those same inset cubes from before. Stretched them, added a beveled edge. It's the same thing literally here. Allows me to just kind of, as in the image, go to the image, there's a door back here, and there's seems to be a photo frame or something. I just added those. Worked quite really well. And then, because these are separate objects, I can edit with the materials and what it's made of, what it looks like in the actual render later on, which I'll explain in another video. So yeah, these are the vents which I had over here, which based off these rayed angled things. I also, to make this, I did it a bit differently. I also have, this is a different Inset Face here, Inset Cube. I actually, as you can kind of tell, I might be able to try and hide these. Maybe that might help. So it kind of hard to tell, but I basically started with an Inset Cube, like that, and then inset the face, obviously, like I did before. Extrude it inwards. Then I beveled the edges first, I think, but I did lots of loop cuts. I did use the numbers perfectly to map them out properly. Then did multiple loop cuts around the other loop cuts. This is how I mapped them out. And then I took these faces. I should have seen it a bit. Took these faces, extruded them outwards to kind of create that separation. Looks awful like that, but that's basically how I created these dividers down the middle. So then I used multiple of the arrays of these fins downwards to fit it in, and then fit it in, and then I duplicated it into the scene, added another one, and scaled it to the image. So scaled it right into the image, kind of thing. Not perfect, but it fits my scene, and that's what looks right. That's basically how I did it. So also with this main scene, if I hide these washers and all the stuff around them, actually in Inset Face, I insert a face so there's actually a bit more depth in between them. As you can see, it kind of adds a bit more darkness and contrast between them. There's a separator, a proper solid gap in between the washing machines. But there's also this edge, which is a beveled cube that I duplicated one side, stretched out, extruded that way, kind of beveled the edges, whatnot, just to add kind of a frame. You can kind of see here, there's that frame along washing machines, which did what looks right. And also there's this cube back here. There you go. It kind of just joins them together, so there's not that gap along the side, but in between them on this axis here. So they do lay together, but there is separation between them. One last thing, tiny detail, I quite liked it. I noticed in the scene, there's a hole in the ceiling, which is a piece of string hanging down. So I created this. This was a Bezier curve as well. Added some depth, turned it into a mesh, and then used proportional editing to scale down this edge. I started with a continuous, it was a solid tube of exactly the same length. And then I scaled down that one face to shrink it, kind of, and proportional editing to kind of add a taper. That's what it is, to add a taper up it so it's thicker at the top than the bottom, more like a string. And that seemed to work well. That's all the objects done, really. That's all the objects that my scene uses. There's more bits and pieces around the place. There's also, there's this crate on top of here, which is just a cube, extruded face, and then added some edges, pulled out this bit, beveled it, rounded it off. Added another spin edged handle, cylinder with a spin on the edge. Add that handle. Yeah, just made it look better. And then rotated it in. Made it just fit the scene. You can see there's a box on top of making this box. It was just to make everything a bit more natural and fit what the actual laundry looks like. That's what worked. There you go. I believe that's the end of the objects. That's all the objects in this scene. There's more bits and pieces around the place that I haven't mentioned, but I won't go into every single detail of how I made every single thing. This took me much longer than I'm showing in this video. So it was also a huge learning process of starting from the beginning with very little knowledge of how to do any of this and teaching myself and learning all of it myself. So yeah, that's the end of this video. I'll see you in the next one for the materials.